Good evening. My name is Kevin Gallivan, and I'm here at the Clarence Library to talk a little Shakespeare. And just so that you're all aware, all your microphones will be muted for the duration of the presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the chat menu located at the bottom of your screen. At the end of the presentation, I'll go through any left there and we'll try to answer any of your questions. And if I don't know the answer, I'll try to make something up. So, let us begin. This figure that thou here seest put, it was for gentle Shakespeare cut, wherein the graver had a strife with nature to outdo the life. Oh, could he have but hit his wit as well, the print would then surpass all that was ever writ in brass. But since he cannot, reader, look not on his picture, but his book. That was the dedication at the first folio, written by Ben Jonson for his friend and sometime rival, William Shakespeare. What is Shakespeare? An image, a body of work, plays and poems. It's difficult to really put it all together. I'm reminded of the opening chorus to Henry V. Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heavens of invention. A kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold the swelling scene. Then should the warlike Harry, like himself, assume the port of Mars, and at his heels, leashed in like hounds, should famine, sword, and fire crouch for employment. But pardon, gentles all, the flat, unraised spirits that have dared on this unworthy scaffold to bring forth so great an object. Can this cockpit hold the vasty fields of France? Or may we cram within this wooden O the very casks that did affright the air at Agincourt? Oh, pardon, since a crooked figure may attest in little space 1,000,000, and let us, ciphers to this great account, on your imaginary forces work. Suppose, within the girdle of these walls are now confined 2 mighty monarchies, whose high upreared and abutting fronts the perilous narrow ocean parts asunder. Piece out our imperfections with your thoughts. Into 1,000 parts divide one man. Think, when we talk of horses, that you see them, printing their proud hoofs on the receiving earth. For 'tis your thoughts that now must deck our kings. Carry them here and there, jumping over times, turning the accomplishments of many years into an hourglass. For the which supply, admit me chorus to this history, who, prologue-like, your humble patience pray, gently to hear, kindly to judge our play. So, I hope that as we go and discuss Shakespeare and the mystery that surrounds him, that you will kindly listen and kindly judge. So, in Eugene O'Neill's autobiographical play, A Long Day's Journey into Night, the character of Tyrone, a former matinee star based on O'Neill's alcoholic father, says, I read all the plays ever written. I studied Shakespeare as you'd study the Bible. I educated myself. I love Shakespeare. I would have acted in any of his plays for nothing, for the joy of being alive in his great poetry. I felt inspired by him. People all over the world have felt that inspiration. Shakespeare has struck a responsive chord in actors and audiences in every generation and in almost every country with a tradition of theater. Every summer we have a Shakespeare in Delaware Park, where more than 40,000 people have viewed Shakespearean productions there since 1976, And of course, in New York City's Central Park, audiences have been watching Shakespeare since 1954. It's almost a cliche, but it should come as no surprise that there are continual productions of Shakespeare all over the United Kingdom and the English-speaking world, and all over Europe, from Spain, France, Germany, all the way to Czechoslovakia, or the former Czech Republic. And it goes even beyond that. Did you know that in 2014, an international Shakespeare conference was held in Tehran, Iran? In the fall of 2018, officials in Fuzhou, in the Chinese province of Fujian, made an exclusive deal with the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust in Stratford-upon-Avon to build a replica of the 16th century house where the playwright was probably born, along with another where he is thought to have died. Fujian leaders insisted that they were serious about making the buildings authentic by using period construction techniques. So, how did Shakespeare become Shakespeare? What is it about Shakespeare that appeals to Chinese, Japanese, all over Asia, India? Indian Bollywood has been making Shakespeare movies based on Shakespeare plays since 1945. And of course, we're almost all familiar with Akira Kurosawa of Japan. Ran, which is his version of King Lear. He also did Throne of Blood, which was his version of Macbeth. And I forget the title of it, but he did one even before that, based on another Shakespeare play. What is it about Shakespeare that translates into all these different languages? There is a Shakespeare lexicon of every word mentioned in the Shakespeare plays, with its definitions and the citing the plays, the act, and the scene where it's mentioned. It was written in the 19th century by a German, and it is still in use today. It's one of the go-to texts. What is it that so motivates Germans? In fact, Germans seem to have a special relationship that they're proud of talking about with Shakespeare. It goes beyond language, because although there is a beauty to the language, and I can see I feel the excitement in it myself sometimes, and I can understand where Eugene O'Neill's father would say that he loved being in the poetry. But there's got to be more to it than that, because it simply doesn't always translate into another language. Recently, a scholar put together a study, and he reasoned that Shakespeare could not have been a Frenchman simply because Shakespeare's poetry, iambic pentameter, and all that does not translate into French with the stresses on vowels. So what is it about Shakespeare? And I think it is in the characters, in the humanity of the characters that he creates. And I will say this, not all of Shakespeare's plays, in my humble opinion, are great, but the ones that are spectacular. And not every Shakespeare character is noteworthy, but there are characters that he has created that have become iconic. And that is because he has a knack or a gift for touching upon the character, the humanity, and the humor. A few great characters made great plays, and it is all due to Shakespeare's genius of invention. Now, excuse me. For about 250 years after Shakespeare died, it was accepted that William Shakespeare, born in Stratford-on-Avon, on or about April 23rd, and died later in 1616 on April 23rd, was the author of the Shakespeare plays. Then doubts were raised, and now we have pretty much a cottage industry. And I like to define it as between, well, let's say the world is divided unevenly into three groups. The first are what I would call the Shakespeareans. These are the people who believe that Shakespeare, William Shakespeare of Stratford, later of London, and then again of Stratford, wrote the plays. Then there are those who I call the anti-Shakespeareans, simply because they started out as being self-styled Baconians, believing that Francis Bacon wrote the plays. And then you had the Oxfordians, who believed that the Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, wrote the plays. And then you have people who now believe that Christopher Marlowe wrote the plays, the Earl of Rutland, a woman by the name of Amelia Lanier, some, including Malcolm X, when he was in prison, he came upon the idea that James I wrote the plays. There are those who believe that Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth, wrote the plays. And the only thing that seems to unite these people is their belief that everybody except William Shakespeare wrote the plays. So I'd simply call them the anti-Shakespeareans. Then there is the third group, and they simply just don't care. Some people will say, what difference does it make as long as we have the plays? What difference does it make who wrote them? And that's a good point. The plays are the plays, they speak for themselves, except with the anti-Shakespeareans, who look at the plays more or less as puzzles and mysteries, and they sort of pull them apart and dissect them, looking for clues about the Earl of Oxford's life or Francis Bacon's life, or secret codes. Especially during the 19th century, secret codes were very big. Secret codes are still pretty big now. There is in England a gentleman by the name of Andrew Waugh. He's Evelyn Waugh's grandson, and he's constantly coming up with these exquisitely arcane theories and of codes and diagrams and everything that prove that Edward de Vere wrote the plays. And it has nothing to do with the plays, but it has to do with where words are positioned on pages and on the flyleaves in there. And I think part of that is a reaction to what is called bardolatry, which is the worship of Shakespeare or everything Shakespearean. People who really have very little exposure to Shakespeare or don't care for that much, but they simply think that because it's Shakespeare, it has to be great. And then there are people who, just everything about Shakespeare is fantastic. And in 1901, George Bernard Shaw coined the term bardolatry in the preface to his collection, 3 Plays for Puritans. He was reacting to the uncritical worship of Shakespeare as the greatest and most important writer to ever have lived. He believed that it was, quote, gross ignorance of Shakespeare and the incapacity for his works that produced indiscriminate eulogies and spurious and silly representations of his plays. And I think that there's a lot of truth in that. If you were able to go back in a time machine to Shakespeare's London around 1590, just as he was coming into London and starting to write, and you asked around who, 400 years from now, people would be talking about as the great playwright, they would have probably thought Christopher Marlowe. Some of them may have said Robert Greene. They really wouldn't have heard much about Shakespeare. And if in 1616 you went back at the year that Shakespeare died and you asked the same question, they would have probably said Ben Jonson. Ben Jonson was riding high, and he was attached to the court of King James, and he was, I don't think they actually had the title, but he's considered to be the first poet laureate of England. Some of them might have said Francis Beaumont. Francis Beaumont died in the same year, and he was a collaborator with Shakespeare. And in fact, there were eulogies written about Francis Beaumont at his death. And I think there was a big funeral for him. And during the Restoration period, after the English Civil War, when Charles II, or Charles I, took over, reclaimed the throne, they reopened the theaters, which had been closed by the Puritans. And for a long time, the plays of Beaumont and Fletcher were performed twice as often as those of Shakespeare. Yet, Shakespeare survives as part of our culture, as part of our language. And Beaumont and Fletcher and most of the Shakespeare's contemporary playwrights are pretty well unknown, except to students in English lit class, and usually English lit majors with an emphasis on Renaissance, English literature. Now, the interesting thing is that a lot of the doubting about Shakespeare originated in the United States. And what makes that interesting is that Shakespeare in many ways is, I would say, uniquely American. The first volume of Shakespeare that came to the shores was in about 1690, and it was the fifth folio of his works. And during the 18th and into the 19th century, especially in the early part of the 19th century, Shakespeare was an important part of American culture. When the pioneers moved west in their wagons, they carried with them usually two books. One was the King James Bible, the other was the collected works of Shakespeare. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote in his journal that beings on other planets probably called the Earth Shakespeare because of Shakespeare's plays. In the gold rush in California, the 49ers whiled away the harsh winter months by sitting around campfires and acting out Shakespeare's plays from memory. His words were well known throughout every stratum of society. Abraham Lincoln, one of his favorite plays was Macbeth. And back then in the 1890s, well, the 1840s, theaters were the main gathering places in most towns and cities. As a result, star actors amassed an immensely loyal following, comparable to modern celebrities. At the same time, audiences always treated theaters as places to make their feelings known, not just towards the actors, but towards their fellow theatergoers of different classes or political persuasions. And theater riots were not a rare occurrence, especially in New York. So how did all that start? Well, as I said, Shakespeare had this unusual hold on American culture. And after the English Civil War, back in the mid-1600s, when Charles I came back, reclaimed the throne, they started dusting off plays, Beaumont and Fletcher, Shakespeare, and others, because the playhouses had been pulled down for the most part during the Puritans when they were in charge. And in 1769, a self-promoting actor by the name of David Garrick started the Shakespeare Jubilee in Stratford-on-Avon. And it was a key moment in Stratford's history. It was a festival which began Stratford-on-Avon's development into a tourist destination. David Garrick, a renowned 18th century actor, theater manager, playwright, and producer. It was a big show. It started out, it was a 3-day celebration. The first day, along the banks of the Avon, they had set out a battery of cannons, which exploded, boomed through the town. Then there was a parade, there was a banquet, there was speeches were made. On the second day, there was a flood. It started raining, and just about everything had to be canceled. The streets were flooded. Hardly anybody was able to attend David Garrick's one presentation that he made. And on the third day, the town was overwhelmed by people who were trying to leave. They couldn't get coaches to get out because the place was sodden. The diarist James Boswell wrote, "After the joy of the Jubilee came the uneasy reflection that I was in a little village in wet weather and knew not how to get away." Nevertheless, that's what got the ball rolling. Shakespeare was revived, and people recognized the greatness of his plays. And as I said, it carried over into to the Americas. And then I think it was 1848, a school teacher and yachtsman wrote a book called The Romance of Yachting. His name was Joseph C. Hart. Now, there is some debate about who first challenged the authorship of the Shakespeare canon. Most people nowadays credit Delia Bacon's philosophy of the plays of Shakespeare unfolded. However, 9 years previously, there was The Romance of Yachting, Voyage the First, by Joseph C. Hart. And I don't think there was a Voyage the Second or the Third. Among the incidental subjects treated in this volume, Hart wrote, there are several favored and prevailing historical assumptions which the author has made the objects of his descent. He, however, holds himself responsible for all his opinions at the bar of enlightened and manly criticism. The subjects thus considered and to which he invites the reader to apply historical tests are these. The precedents claimed for the Puritans in the introduction here of freedom, religion, and civilization, the misrepresentation of Spanish female character and the character of the Spanish people generally, the original cause of the invasion of Spain by the Moors, in modern times supposed to be attributed to the violence done to the daughter of Julian, and the position generally assigned to Shakespeare as a superior literary genius. Hart believed that William Shakespeare was a manager of a theater, not a writer, and that he hired a factotum. And as he writes, a factotum is kept to revise, to strike out, to refit, revamp, interpolate, disfigure, to do anything you please, the vulgar and vicious taste of the multitude. No play will succeed without it, well peppered with vulgarity and obscenity. Betterton the player and Rowe the writer make a selection from a promiscuous heap of plays found in a garret, nameless to authorship. I want an author for this selection of plays, said Rowe. I haven't, said Betterton, call them Shakespeare's. A writer in Larner's Cabinet Cyclopedia undertakes to give us the history of his family, from which I gather that John Shakespeare, the father, was very poor and very illiterate. But the poverty of the family is nothing in this case, except to show that William Shakespeare must necessarily have been an uneducated boy. He grew up in ignorance and viciousness. It is a fraud upon the world to thrust his surreptitious fame upon him. So, Basically, Shakespeare is this nasty money-grubbing manager, has all these plays that these poor, decent playwrights have submitted to him. He's bought them and he throws them to this factotum to put in pornography and to please the vulgar multitudes. Now, Hart was from New York, so he goes to the theater and he sees the vulgar multitudes all about him. These people who are of the lower class. Herman Melville had an opinion of the Romance of Yachting. Here's a book positively turned wrong side out. The title page on the cover, an index to the whole in more ways than one. I open at the beginning and find myself in the middle of the Blue Laws of Dr. O'Callaghan. Then, proceeding, find several extracts from the log book of Noah's Ark. Still further, take a hand at 3 or 4 bullfights. And then I sat down to digest all the commentators on Shakespeare, who, according to our author, was a dunce and a blackguard. The book deserves to be burnt in a fire of Estephidian, and by the hand that wrote it. And there are some who believe that Hart may have gotten his ideas from a lecture delivered by Delia Bacon. Hart's views on Shakespeare were largely dismissed, since apparently he was unaware that Rowe's 1709 edition of Shakespeare was not the first publication of the works. He had no idea about the first folio in 1623. He had no idea about the subsequent folios, and he had no idea about any of the quarto texts. Now, I've mentioned Delia Bacon. Delia Bacon is no relation to the Elizabethan Sir Francis Bacon. However, he does play a large part in her theory. She was born in 1811 in a log cabin on the Ohio frontier. She was the youngest daughter of a congregational minister who had taken his family from New England to found a Congregationalist community in the wilderness. Delia was, by most accounts, a brilliant young woman. Unfortunately, her family could not provide her with an advanced education. She became a teacher in schools in Connecticut, New Jersey, and New York, and until about 1852 became a distinguished professional lecturer, conducting in various eastern United States cities classes for women in history and literature. She published her first book in 1831 at the age of 20. And in 1832, she beat Edgar Allan Poe in a short story contest for a prize of $100. She read, studied, and lectured on Shakespeare, and she believed that the plays were best read because the stage productions could never compare with the imagination. Nevertheless, in 1839, she wrote a play herself, based on a tragic incident during the French and Indian War. In 1846, at the age of 35, she met Alexander McWhorter, a Yale graduate divinity student, 11 years her younger. They kept close company, and many people, including, it seems, Delia, thought they were engaged. Unfortunately, Alexander didn't, and Alexander is something of a shit. Delia's brother Leonard demanded that McWhorter make his intentions clear towards his sister. McWhorter claimed that they were not engaged, and he had no intentions of marrying Delia. To make matters worse, McWhorter behaved like a cad and began entertaining his friends with excerpts from Delia's love letters. Leonard brought charges against McWhorter in an ecclesiastic court. The trial was an embarrassment to Delia, especially when the jury of ministers split 12-11 in McWhorter's favor. Catherine Beecher, the sister of Harriet Beecher Stowe, Delia's friend, tried to come to Delia's defense by publishing a book on the matter called Truth Stranger Than Fiction. And she did it against Delia's wishes because it only publicized the matter and made her embarrassment worse. As James Shapiro wrote in his book, Contested Will, Who Wrote Shakespeare, Delia was now set on showing the world the difference between surface and deeper meaning. She had been deceived by the surface attentions of McWhorter and by her church and perhaps by her God. In her world, it was impossible to deny the existence of God, but she could deny the existence of the godlike Shakespeare. She had support and encouragement from many leading literary figures in America, including Herman Melville and Emerson, even if they didn't believe her theory, which Emerson obviously didn't. She pursued her research in England. Hawthorne arranged a meeting with Thomas Carlyle, and Carlyle shrieked when he heard her theory, but he was impressed by her sincerity. In 1857, with Hawthorne's secret financial support, she published The Philosophy of the Plays of Shakespeare Unfolded. Like subsequent anti-Shakespearean tomes, it was huge, overlong, and like Hart's Yachting, it could be rambling and sometimes incoherent. However, it did possess some interesting analyses of some of Shakespeare's plays. The conclusion of her work was that Sir Francis Bacon put together a consortium of aristocratic writers who, fearing reprisals from the first Queen Elizabeth's administration and later King James, wrote the plays to promote their subversive ideas. While in England, she became obsessed with the idea that the secret to Shakespeare's true identity could be found in his grave. In the dead of night, she entered Trinity Church in Stratford, where he lay buried, and at the last moment, her courage failed her, and she left the grave undisturbed. Shortly after that, she had a mental breakdown. For a time, she claimed to be channeling the spirit of Sir Francis Bacon. She was committed to an asylum near Stratford, and later she returned to the United States, where she was placed in another sanatorium by her brother, and there she died. Emerson called her a genius but mad and ranked her with Walt Whitman as America's greatest literary producer of the past 10 years. Hawthorne paid the highest tribute in his autobiography. She recognized a depth in Shakespeare's plays which scholars, critics, and learned societies had never imagined to exist there. And when she passed into the better world, I know not why we should hesitate to believe that the immortal poet may have met her at the threshold and let her in, thanking her for having interpreted him to mankind so well. The idea that Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, was a fellow who wrote Shakespeare, it comes to us from a fellow by the name of J. Thomas Loney, and he spells his name L-O-O-N-E-Y, which most people would call Looney, and so did I, but I actually had a lot of sympathy for him, so I try to call him Loney as much as possible. Sometimes I slip. As a young man, he was a member of the Church of Humanity. The church worshipped human genius and potential, honoring the great geniuses of the past. The church gave special prominence to Shakespeare, naming a month after him in the positivist calendar and placing a bust of him in its place of worship. Loney became a leader in his church, but unfortunately, the church went bust and the membership drifted away. And he was left with basically just a statue of Shakespeare. And you sort of feel that, you know, he was very religious, and he had this theory of human genius, but he felt betrayed. And he felt betrayed by his God, if you will, and that was Shakespeare. So he looked for a way to bring Shakespeare down. And he did that when he came across a poem written by the Earl of Oxford. And he thought that it had a similar cadence to Shakespeare's sonnets. And from that, he extrapolated that de Vere wrote Shakespeare. And the Oxfordians today have taken it and run with it. And they believe that Shakespeare was the Earl of Oxford, and that the play Hamlet is basically autobiographical. And not only that, but Loney and other Oxfordians also believe that Oxford wrote plays and poems under the names of other poets. In fact, Oxford himself did employ as a secretary John Lilly, who was a poet in his own right, and so they naturally assumed that Oxford wrote everything that Lilly wrote. And it goes so far to the King James Bible was obviously written by the Earl of Oxford. And they developed now what they call the Prince Tutor theory, where the Earl of Oxford, who was a favorite of Queen Elizabeth, had an affair with her. And they had a son who went on to become the Earl of Southampton. And I'm not entirely sure, but I think that they also believe that somehow the Earl of Oxford was Elizabeth's child, illegitimate child as well. So it gets very, very complex. And everybody is involved in the conspiracy. Since Looney's time, they have always ignored the fact that Oxford died 12 years before Shakespeare and could not have written his later plays. But it doesn't matter because there is a conspiracy to hush things up, and it is also involved with the Stratford Shakespeare industrial complex. So many people have money involved in it and reputations. Which brings us to Charlton Ogborne Jr. Ogborne was a devoted son. Along with his mother, he continued a tradition begun by his father, Charlton Sr., who was a lawyer. In 1940, Charlton Wisner Barrow argued on the basis of X-ray evidence that the Ashbourne portrait in the Folger Shakespeare Library was originally thought to represent Shakespeare. And he believed it was, it actually depicted Edward de Vere. One by the name of Meredith Underhill, a descendant of a Stratford-upon-Avon family, contemporary with Shakespeare's, contacted the Folger Shakespeare Library curator of books and manuscripts, Giles Dawson, and in 1947, about the authorship question of Shakespeare. Dawson's response included a dismissal of Barrow's examination of the Ashbourne portrait as fraudulent. The letter resurfaced in 1948 at a meeting of the Shakespeare Fellowship in New York, when Underhill was prevented from speaking in favor of Shakespeare's authorship. Represented by Charlton Ogborne, Barrow subsequently sued Dawson for libel for $50,000. Barrow was never able to produce the photographs and other pieces of evidence cited in his Scientific American article. After reaching the Washington, D.C. District Court, the suit was dropped in November 1950. In 1979, the coat of arms was rediscovered on the portrait following the restoration, and it was identified as that of Hugh Hammersley, Lord Mayor of London, in 1627. After representing Barrow in the case against Dawson, Ogborne and his wife Dorothy both became very involved in the organizations devoted to Oxfordian theory and the Shakespearean authorship question. They subsequently published 2 books on the subject together, The Renaissance Man of England and This Star of England in 1952, both of which argued in favor of Oxford's authorship. The books also advocate the Prince Tutor theory. Charlton Jr. carried on the family tradition, authoring The Mysterious William Shakespeare, The Myth and the Reality in 1984. One of the things about Charlton is that, Charlton Jr., is that he had been, during World War II, he was in Merrill's Marauders, which was a combat unit in Indian Burma. and they were behind the lines, and they suffered terribly. And they never got the recognition that they deserved. In fact, young Ogborn wrote a book about it, which was later became a movie called Merrill's Marauders. But he felt that his friends and comrades had been cheated. And I think that this struck a responsive chord in him, because he really felt that Edward de Vere had been cheated. And there was a documentary that was made in the 80s, not long before Ogborn's death. And he, when talking about de Vere, he got very emotional. And he actually wept. He had been in failing health, and he died at the age of 87. So what is it about Shakespeare that I think is so great, and why do I think that William Shakespeare wrote William Shakespeare? I think Shakespeare was a great listener. Andrew Gurr, who has written several books about Shakespeare and Shakespeare's world and Shakespeare's stage, felt that, or believed that Shakespeare probably wrote many of his plays in taverns, simply because he would be writing at night. Candles were expensive, and he would have his dinner and a few drinks, and he could sit there in the light of the candlelight of the tavern writing. And I think that Shakespeare had an ear for the way people talked. I think that there is an evolution in Shakespeare's writing. If you read his earlier plays, they are very long-winded sometimes. There's not much difference between the way the speeches he did between his writings and, say, Robert Greene or Christopher Marlowe. But he has a knack for capturing the cadence of the way people speak. And I think one of the best examples is in Henry V, where we know about, most people are familiar with Henry V, and especially from, it was most recently done by Kenneth Branagh back in the 80s, and then of course in 1945, it was done by Laurence Olivier. And it's a very rabble-rousing play, very heroic. And there are elements of it that I think truly catch Shakespeare's knack for listening. And we all know about the great speeches like, "Once more into the breach, dear friends, once more, close up the wall with our English dead. In peace there's nothing so becomes a man as modest stillness and humility. But when the blast of war blows in our ears, then imitate the action of the tiger. Stiffen the sinews, summon up the blood, disguise fair nature with hard-favored rage. Then lend the eye a terrible aspect, And you, good yeoman, whose limbs were made in England, show us here the metal of your pasture. Let us swear that you are worth your breeding, which I doubt not. For there is none of you so mean and base that hath not noble lustre in your eyes. I see you stand like greyhounds in the slips, straining upon the start. The game's afoot, follow your spirit, and upon this charge cry God for Harry, England, and St. George. Immediately after that, you have King Henry demanding the surrender of the city of Harfleur. And we get a different idea of what war is about. So Henry, he is the hero of the play. He's demanding the surrender of the city that they are besieging. How yet resolves the governor of the town? This is the latest power we will admit. Therefore, to our best mercies give yourselves. Alike to men proud of destruction, defy us to our worst. For as I am a soldier, a name that in my thoughts becomes me best, if I begin the half-achieved Harfleur, I will not leave it until her ashes she lie buried. The gates of mercy shall be all shut up, and the flesh soldier, rough and hard of heart, in liberty a bloody hand shall range with conscience wide as hell, mowing like grass your fresh fair virgins and your flowering infants. What is it then to me if impious war arrayed in flames, like to the prince of fiends, do with his smirched complexion all fell feats and link to waste and desolation? What is it then to me when you yourselves are cause, if your fair maids fall into the hands of hot and forcing violation? Therefore, you men of Harfleur, take pity of your town and of your people, whiles yet the cool and temperate winds of grace o'erblow the filthy and contagious clouds of heady murder, spoil, and villainy. If not, why in a moment look to see the blind and bloody soldier with foul hand defile the locks of your shrill shrieking daughters, your fathers taken by their reverend beards, and their most reverend heads dashed to the wall, your naked infants spitted upon pikes, while their mad mothers with howls confused do break the clouds as did the wives of Jewry against Herod's bloody hunting slaughtermen. What say you? Will you yield and this avoid, or guilty in defense be thus destroyed? Now that is an interesting counterpoint. You have rape, murder, slaughter, all promised by the hero, as against the enthusiasm and heroic appeal of the previous speech. And then, before the Battle of Agincourt, when Henry's army, cold and hungry, are gathered around campfires, waiting for the morning, and they're hearing off in the distance the French are preparing their arms for attack, and they're feeling outnumbered and lost and alone. And as the chorus says, that Harry will move among them, give them a little touch of Harry in the night as he goes from campfire to campfire in disguise. And he comes to this one group of men, among them Bates and Williams, and Henry says to them, as pretending to be a fellow soldier, "Methinks I could not die anywhere so contented as in the king's company, his cause being just and his quarrel honorable." Bates: "He may show what outward courage he will, but I believe as cold a night as 'tis, he could wish himself in Thames up to the neck, and so would he were, and I by him at all adventure, so we were quit of here." Williams: "That's more than we know." Bates: "Aye, or more than we should seek after, for we know enough if we know that we are the king's subjects. If his cause be wrong, our obedience to the king wipes the crime of it out of us. Williams. But if the cause be not good, the king himself hath a heavy reckoning to make, when all those legs and arms chopped off in battle shall join together at the latter day and cry all, we died at such a place. Some swearing, some crying for a surgeon, some upon their wives left poor behind, some upon the debts they owe, some upon their children rawly left. I am afeard there are few die well that die in a battle, for how can they charitably dispose of anything when blood is their argument? Now, if these men do not die well, it will be a black matter for the king that led them to it, whom to disobey were against all proportion of subjection. During Elizabeth's time, they were fighting in Ireland, in the bogs. They were fighting in the Netherlands. As a matter of fact, Ben Jonson had been a soldier in the Netherlands for a while. And men were coming back to England, wounded, disfigured, maimed, and most of them unemployable or unemployed. Even though they weren't wounded, they had no jobs. They were just being mustered out of the army. And that, I think, is a speech that Shakespeare might have heard at the bar of the Mermaid Tavern as he was sitting there, scribbling away. That's the sort of thing that real people talk about. And I think that, that he had the grasp for it. When I talked about bardolatry, I mentioned oops. I mentioned his early writings and how he developed as time went on. One of his first is Titus Andronicus, which was about maybe 10, 15 years ago made into a movie. And I remember when I took a course in Shakespeare at Canisius College, our teacher had us read Titus, and she wanted us to read it because she wanted us to know that not everything Shakespeare wrote was great. There's one scene where Titus, what starts out that Titus returns from defeating the Goths. He's captured the queen and her 3 sons. And Titus himself has lost, he had like about 20 sons, and I think 18 of them were killed in the war. And he comes back and he presents the queen of the Goths to the emperor. And he demands as his due that her oldest son be sacrificed. And she begs for her son's life, and the young man gets taken off and killed. And she decides to have revenge, and she decides to have extreme revenge. And that's one of the things that characterizes Elizabethan and Jacobean revenge plays. They're always extreme. So she winds up marrying the emperor, and then she and her cohort, Aaron the Moor, begin to plot Titus's destruction. And one of the things they do is when Titus and his son-in-law Basilius are out hunting, the queen's 2 sons rape Titus's daughter. And then to make sure that they can't be identified by her, they cut out her tongue so she can't speak, and they cut off her hands so she can't write. And she's wandering through the forest, and Titus's brother, her uncle, finds her. And he sees her, and he says, "Who is this? My niece that flies away so fast? Cousin, a word, where is your husband? If I do dream, would all my wealth would wake me. If I do wake, some planet strike me down, that I may slumber in eternal sleep. Speak, gentle niece. What stern, ungentle hands have lopped and hewed and made thy body bare of her two branches, those sweet ornaments whose circling shadows kings have sought to sleep in, and might not gain so great a happiness as have thy love? Why dost thou not speak to me? Alas, a crimson river of warm blood, like to a bubbling fountain stirred with wind, doth rise and fall between thy lips, coming and going with thy honey breath. But sure, some Tiresias hath deflowered thee, and lest thou shouldst detect him, cut thy tongue. And now thou turn'st away thy face for shame, and notwithstanding all this loss of blood, as from a conduit with 3 issuing spouts, yet do thy cheeks look red as Titan's face, blushing to be encountered with a cloud. Shall I speak for thee? Shall I say 'tis so? Oh, that I knew thy heart and knew thy breast, that I might rail him and to ease my mind. And this goes on for 20 more lines. And I think a modern audience seeing that today would say, get her a bandage. Just, this poor woman is gushing blood standing there while he's going on. But that was early Shakespeare. And that was the way to go if you wanted to break into the playwriting business. It was comparable to breaking into Hollywood back in the 80s and 90s with slasher films, because they did love the blood. Ben Jonson, after Shakespeare's death, as he wrote a dedicatory poem, very effusive, where he called, to the first folio, where he called him the sweet swan of Avon. And later on, Jonson, who, as I mentioned, was at once both a friend and a rival to Shakespeare, was visiting a friend called William Drummond, I think was his name. Drummond was the last name. Anyways, he told him his opinion of Shakespeare. He said, many times, I remember the players have often mentioned it as an honor to Shakespeare, that in his writing, whatsoever he penned, he never blotted out line. My answer had been, would he had blotted 1,000, which they thought a malevolent speech. I had not told posterity this, but for their ignorance, who choose that circumstance to compliment their friend by wherein he most faulted. For I did love the man, and do honor his memory, this side idolatry, as much as any. He was indeed of open and free nature, had excellent fantasies and gentle expressions, wherein he flowed with such facility that sometimes it was necessary he should be stopped. Sufflamandus erat, as Augustus said of Atterius. His wit was in his own power. Would that the rule of it had been so too. Many times he fell into such things could not escape laughter, as when he said in the person of Caesar, one speaking to him, Caesar, thou dost me wrong. He replied, Caesar did never wrong, but with just cause, and such like, which were ridiculous. But he redeemed his vices with his virtues. There was ever more in him to be praised than to be pardoned. And I think that although that disturbed Jonson, one of the things about Shakespeare that I like is the fact that he had that knack for finding natural humor. One of the earliest, I think, is in Richard III, where Richard has arranged to have his brother, who is the Duke of Clarence, murdered. And it was pretty much well known by the audience that he was going to be drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. So Clarence is in the Tower of London awaiting his fate, uncertain as what's to happen. He has a nightmare, and the jailer, Brackenbury, comes to him, find out what's going on. And Clarence tells him about the nightmare. Methought that Gloucester stumbled, and in falling struck me that thought to stay him overboard into the tumbling billows of the main. Lord, Lord, methought, what pain it was to drown. What dreadful noise of waters in mine ears. What ugly sights of death within mine eyes. Methought I saw 1,000 fearful wrecks, 10,000 men that fishes gnawed upon, wedges of gold, great anchors, heaps of pearl, inestimable stones, unvalued jewels, all scattered at the bottom of the sea. Some lay in dead men's skulls, and in those holes where eyes did once inhabit, there were crept as 'twere in scorn of eyes, reflecting gems which wooed the slimy bottom of the deep, and mocked the dead bones that lay scattered by. Brackenbury. Had you such leisure in time of death to gaze upon the secrets of the deep? Now that's not exactly a knee slapper, true, but I think you have Clarence going on and on about this terrible dream of drowning, and then Brackenbury, kind of flat-footed, brings it, back to earth. And one of my favorites, and I think another which I think is the natural humor of the situation, is in Macbeth. Now, I think most of us are familiar with the plot. Macbeth is the noble soldier, and he's told by 3 witches that he's going to be the king someday. And his first response is, if chance will have me king, then chance will make me king. But nevertheless, it starts preying upon his mind. And then he lets his wife know about it, and she is ambitious for him as well. And it becomes that they realize that they're going to kill the king. And so the king comes to visit them in Macbeth's castle. And so the night of the murder, there's this tremendous tension being built up. And Macbeth goes and he kills the king. He comes back, he's bearing the knives that he used to kill the king. And his wife yells at him, and then he killed the king's guards. His wife yells at him, "You brought the daggers from the place?" And he's, who would have thought the old man had so much blood in him? And she has to take the knives back, and he's pondering. He heard the guards say their prayers, and he said he couldn't say amen. Why couldn't he say amen? He's this tension is building, and then you have the porter scene, which is usually supposed to be a comic scene, but it's not really, because the porter is the porter to hell. He pretends he's the porter to hell. He's talking about death and sinners who are coming to hell, and there's the banging on the door, knock, knock, knock. And it's when the porter opens the gates, he's actually opening the gates of hell, and in comes Macduff. And So Macduff goes up the stairs to wake the king. And Macbeth is downstairs with Macduff's companion, young Lennox. And there has been all this tension, and young Lennox and Macduff and Macbeth are standing down there, and Lennox says, "Goes the king hence today?" Macbeth: "He does. He did appoint so." Lennox: "The night has been unruly. Where we lay, our chimneys were blown down, and as they say, lamentings heard in the air, strange screams of death, and crying and prophesying with accents terrible of dire combustion and confused events new hatched to the woeful time. The obscure bird clamored the livelong night. Some say the earth was feverish and did shake." Macbeth: "'Twas a rough night." And when I saw Orson Welles deliver that line, it cracked me up. But anyways, so that is some of the reasons why. There's a lot more. As you can see, I've been awash here trying to convey things, but I think the idea that Shakespeare was capable of capturing character and conveying that. And I think that even in translation, this conveys to other people, and that you could enjoy, and we can especially enjoy Shakespeare because English is our first language, but that other people do as well throughout the world, and that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. One last point, and this has to do the Oxfordians, and then they pull apart the Shakespeare plays looking for clues. And I found a couple of clues about Shakespeare and his father. John Shakespeare was an alderman in the town of Stratford, which would be like mayor. He was a successful glove maker. Gloves were very fancy items, and all the fine people had these very ornate gloves. And he gambled a little bit in illicit wool selling, which was basically tax evasion. And he got caught, and his family had a downturn. And in Much Ado About Nothing, there is a character called Dogberry. And Dogberry is sort of minor official. He's kind of a constable. And he's very self-important. He speaks, he uses words that he doesn't really know what they mean. But he saves the day. He's the one who arrests the henchman of the villain. And he takes him to be interrogated by the judge. And after the interrogation, the judge and the sexton leave, and the sexton was the man who was taking down all the notes. And the villain is Conrad, or the henchman is Conrad, and he calls Dogberry an ass. He said, "You are an ass. You are an ass." And Dogberry is all upset because the man who writes this down is gone. "Dost thou not suspect my place? Dost thou not suspect my years? Oh, that he were here to write me down an ass. But masters, remember that I am an ass, though it be not written down. Yet forget not that I am an ass. No, thou villain, thou art full of piety, as shall be proved upon thee by good witness. I am a wise fellow, and which is more, an officer. and which is more a householder, and which is more as pretty a piece of flesh as any in Messina, and one that knows the law go to, and a rich fellow enough go to, and a fellow that hath known losses, and one that hath 2 gowns, and everything handsome about it. Bring him away, oh, that I had been writ down an ass. And it's that little line there, that I had known losses. And I think that that was a little way of Shakespeare getting a bit of his dad in there. And another thing is in Romeo and Juliet. And this, it's easier for a pauper to play a king than for a king to play a pauper. Because a king has things done for him all the time, and he just has to act pompous. But a king playing a pauper, he wouldn't know what to do because he doesn't know how poor people live. And there's a scene where Capulet in Romeo and Juliet, Capulet, Juliet's father, is throwing a party, and he's overseeing everything. Now, in the great houses, the Earl of Oxford home, for example, if the Earl of Oxford wanted, or Sir Francis Bacon wanted to throw a party, he'd tell his steward, I'm going to have a party. I'm going to invite 100 people. See to it. And then the steward would get all the other people, the yeomen and whatnot, get them working on it, the butlers. The lord of the manor wouldn't have anything to do with it. But someone like Shakespeare's father would. And in that scene, Capulet, the parties, they're getting ready for it. More light, you knaves, and turn the tables up, and quench the fire, the room is grown too hot. Ah, sirrah, this unlooked for sport comes well. Nay, sit, good cousin Capulet, for you and I are past our dancing days. How long is it now since last yourself and I were in a mask? And that's it. That bit of little realism there is evidence to me that Shakespeare was Shakespeare. That was what his father would have said when he was an alderman and entertaining visiting dignitaries or the other dignitaries of the town. So, I think that if there are any questions, I would be happy to entertain them. Are there?
We did have a question for you or anyone else in here from Bonnie. She asked if anybody had read Hamlet, which was the historical. I remember correctly. I should know this. It was a historical fiction about Shakespeare's son that came out this past year. So she was asking if you or anybody else had read it.
I haven't read it yet, no.
Me neither, for what it's worth.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody for bearing with me. I would like to thank Monica Mooney for her enthusiasm and support and for providing the venue. I would like to thank Jeremy Cassidy here for his technical expertise. I would like to thank my lovely wife for her indulgence and support. And if we shadows have offended, think but this and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here, while these visions did appear, and this weak and idle theme no more yielding but a dream. And I hope you were able to stay awake. So our revels now are ended, and I shall melt into air, into thin air.